Okay, then we now started. It's almost time now. So welcome everybody. Welcome. I hope that we all have our early morning cup of coffee, and we welcome Professor Kai Wieman from Stanford. Now, I used to call name Wieman because it was a German pronunciation. The Kai, he got his undergraduate degree from MIT, and then his PhD from Stanford. And in fact, he needs no introduction because he's really, a prominent scientist. But I just mentioned a few things that he won the Lawrence Medal in 1998, and 3 years later, he got the Nobel Prize in physics because his work on both Einstein condensation. But his for us, his really interesting part is that he is very interested in science education and in the new way of teaching. I read a number of his papers and his book, and then I think the important thing I think he will talk about that later in his lecture, that he thinks that our teaching method had to follow the new advancement in our cognitive science and brain science, so that it could be more efficient and more effective. And he established a number of centers for science education, and you can see that in British Columbia, in Colorado, and now in Stanford. To me, the wonderful thing is that he won the Edan Prize in 2020. There's a new prize, I think, to be awarded to people who have done excellent work, outstanding work in the research in science education. I think this is a very interesting prize, and it has a lot of money too. But I think that we will leave the time to Carl for his lecture. Carl, please start your lecture now. Thank you.
Okay. So thank you. It's a pleasure to talk about, really, I'm going to be about a scientific approach to science and engineering education. And what I'll start with just a general introduction about how the brain learns complex thinking and our new insights about this. And then I'll focus down to applying these ideas in university classrooms and measuring the results, some of the studies we've done on that. And then I'll focus down into more detail about details of what we've learned from this classroom research about what specific things are important to improve learning and why. And these are things you can use in your own teaching. Now, before I get into this, though, I want to give a little background about how I got involved in working on education research. And it actually started out not from my actual classroom teaching, but my working with my research students in my atomic physics program. And I saw these students they would come into my lab, and they had many years of great success in coursework and physics and mathematics. But when I would then put them in a position to actually do physics, they really didn't seem to know how to do it. But it wasn't something fundamentally wrong with them, because just a few years later, after they'd been working in the research lab, they had turned into expert physicists. And so after I saw this happen enough times, I decided there was just some fundamental puzzle here about how people learned, that they could do so well in physics courses and not be learning really how to do physics. And so that got me started in tackling this as a research project of studying how people learn, particularly how they learn physics. And this was, almost 35 years ago now, but from that, there was enough research done then that I could understand this puzzle. I actually realized it actually made sense. It made me start to realize there were much more effective ways to teach, but it also got me started doing this kind of science education research, doing experiments and collecting data and analyzing that in terms of basic principles about learning. But all of this time, my focus has really been on, call it expertise, thinking about how a good scientist or engineer, how the thinking they do and how we can develop that thinking in students, how they best learn it. Now, so moving on into the heart of the talk, this complex thinking like a scientist, there's been major progress in understanding how the learning and teaching that over the last couple of decades. Both the cognitive psychologists who study in the laboratory basic processes of thinking and learning, brain research, and the kind of work that I do of doing studies within university science and engineering classrooms and doing experiments in those. And I'll start with sort of the most fundamental finding of this research, which is really, it's rethinking how learning happens. And the old model of thinking about learning, which is still pervasive throughout our university systems, is that these student brains, they come into the classroom and they vary in different ways, and we immerse them in knowledge and these courses, and that knowledge soaks in to different amounts depending on what that brain was like. And so with this being the model, then the focus is on testing and selecting the best brains that are going to absorb the knowledge the best, and what kind of knowledge soup to immerse them in that's going to soak in. Now, this model is very widespread and sort of very fundamental in how we do things. We have all these selection exams and so on about who gets into the university and who doesn't and so on. And so it's very pervasive, but it's also just wrong. That in fact, what the research shows us is quite a different model to think about learning. That these brains come into the classroom and at the university level, they actually aren't that different, but they're also quite changeable. And so it's really the brain, the learning is the brain transforming through the thinking it's doing in the educational process, that they actually are changing how the neurons are hooked up as a result of this thinking. And this transformed or rewired brain has new improved capabilities. And you can now see this with modern brain imaging, with this example I show here, where they're looking at two people in an fMRI machine interpreting a medical x-ray. And on the right is a medical student who's just learning how to do this. On the left is an expert radiologist who's highly trained at this. And you can see their brains are activated in completely different ways. So this is just an example of the brain changing and developing through the learning process. So one of the basic finding is that the brain research is telling us that really that the learning that we're trying to achieve here is a result of enhancing the relevant neuron connections. And so developing these neuron connections is really very similar to a muscle development, that you have to use that muscle intensively and over a long time. And as a result, it changes and gets more effective, bigger and stronger. And so the same ideas apply to the brain, actually, that more effective ways to teach are having the brain practice and develop these new capabilities, these new skills. And in fact, people are continually learning better ways to help the brain develop. And one of the best examples of this, is perfect pitch, which for a long time was thought to be some extraordinary natural talent, that some people had perfect pitch. Now, as people understood how the brain develops and learns, they found ways that you can actually now teach this perfect pitch to almost every child. So we're not that advanced yet in teaching science education, but we're making a lot of progress in figuring out how to do it better. And so I'll now move on to that, of giving you some examples of different things we're doing in the university classroom and seeing the kind of results we have. So this first example is from teaching a large introductory physics class and doing a comparison between two essentially identical sections of students in this class, but they're taught in different ways. And so the control section of this class is taught by a highly experienced professor who has good student ratings, but taught in basically the standard lecture approach. And the experimental class is taught by someone who is a new physics PhD, but trained in these principles and methods of research-based teaching, the kind of things I'm going to be telling you about in this talk. And the two instructors agreed to cover the same material in the same amount of class time. And then the students were given a common exam right after that to test how much they'd learned and compare the learning between the two sections. So in the experimental section, the students didn't come in and listen to lecture. They had a short pre-class reading assignment that just had them learn basic facts and terminology without spending class time on that. And then the class would start with questions that the students would have to solve. For example, this is an example of one where they have a light bulbs and batteries here. And the students are then asked to predict, once this switch is closed, what the brightness of bulb number 2 is going to happen. And every student then has to answer this. They use a clicker or a device, or nowadays just a mobile phone. And so every student has to think about what the answer is and choose that, and then the instructor's computer records who the students were and what answer they chose. Now, but they're not given the answer then. Instead, they then have to discuss with their neighbors which answer's right and why, and then they have to re-vote. And this is a critical element of the learning process, this discussing with each other. But also, while they're doing that discussion, the instructor isn't just sitting waiting. The instructor's circulating, listening in on those conversations, getting a little snapshot of what's going on in the students' brains, what aspects of their thinking are like a physicist and what are not. Then what happens is they do the demonstration, show the result of what actually happens with the light bulb. And then the instructor has a follow-up summary where it gives feedback on which models and reasoning the students have are correct, and even more important, which were incorrect and why they were incorrect. That element of seeing when one is incorrect and how to change it is really one of the critical aspects of when learning takes place. And so this is an example, one kind of question. On more mathematical topics, the students would have to still be figuring things out, talking to each other, but they write out answers on worksheets. So if you think about this, the students are, in this case, they're getting practice thinking like physicists. They're having to take this situation and then apply a conceptual model of how electricity works and how it's going to work in these light bulbs. And then they have to test that idea by comparing their prediction with what happens, and also in critiquing the reasoning of each other's, their fellow students' arguments during this discussion. So this is basically, developing their capabilities of thinking this way by actually having practice and getting feedback on it. They're getting feedback on their thinking from other students and from comparing with the demonstration, and from the instructor, who's now much more informed about their thinking from listening in on those conversations. Okay, so this is how the experimental classes run. The lecture classes, I assume you all are familiar with how lecture classes go, but so that then both sections were given this quiz to test how they're learning on this. And this is the results with the histogram with the number of students here versus their score on this test. And you can see there's a profound difference between the two, with the experimental class scoring much higher. In fact, it's even a little higher, the comparisons even more dramatic than you might realize, because on this particular test, random guessing would give a student on average 3. And so the amount of learning is really a measure of sort of how far above 3 a student is. And when you look at it that way, you realize just how tiny the amount of learning from listening to the lecture actually is. And both in this case, and then I can show you other cases we've done similar studies. But the other thing I want to emphasize that this shows is that the entire distribution is moved up here. And so this way of teaching isn't just helping the better students or the weaker students learn. It's really more effective for the entire student population. Now, that's an example from introductory physics, just to show that this works in other cases and another situation. This is a similar comparison of teaching methods, but in this case, they looked at the entire result of the entire course and looked at how many students failed or dropped the course versus how many were successful. And it was in the 4 main introductory computer science courses at UC San Diego. And in this case, they did the same basic experiment, except they had the same teachers first teaching the 1 year with standard lecture instruction. And then the same 4 teachers switched to this sort of scientific teaching using just what I presented before, of students being posed with questions and having to talk with each other about the answer to those questions. And what they saw then was that the drop in failure rate decreased dramatically in all cases with the scientific teaching. And so now they have the same 4 instructors, but just because they've adopted better teaching methods, they have a much lower failure rate than they did, about 1/3 what it used to be. Now, most of the kind of research studies have been done in introductory classes, but my group in particular has been extending these same approaches and methods into more advanced classes. And so we now have almost all of the advanced courses taken by a physics major at Stanford are taught in this way. And you can just see examples of these pictures where, in these courses, it's highly mathematical. So they're doing lots of work on worksheets of working out mathematics and justifying it and explaining it and so on, working in small groups. And the instructors are circulating around here giving feedback regularly. And in fact, it's even been demonstrated to work well in advanced graduate courses. And in all of these cases, the basic structure is the same, that students start out with the instructor introduces some activity to them, and the students may have done some background reading and prepared for the class. Then the instructor introduces the activity, and then the students will work for typically 10 or 15 minutes at a time, working through these activities while the instructor is circulating, monitoring how they're doing. And then the instructor will regularly stop and pull the class together to give feedback to the students on their thinking and how they progressed, and answer questions. And then the students will return to continue on working through the worksheet through the entire, as much time as you have class for. And the essential features are that the students are thinking, they're practicing the expert reasoning you want them to learn, and the instructors are much more knowledgeable about that thinking, and so they're able to be more effective in teaching, more effective to giving feedback to the students on their learning during this process. And I'll just say in passing that once the instructors learn to do this, they all find it much more enjoyable to teach this way than just giving lectures. And so once we see many instructors, once they've switched to teaching this way, they never go back, because it just, the teaching is a much more rewarding process. So these are just a few examples. There's about 1,000 research studies have actually been able to dig up that do comparisons across different science and engineering courses, comparing this kind of active learning with traditional lecture. And they consistently show greater learning, and they show lower failure rates. So let me now move on to talk about more detailed aspects of the research, about aspects of really things to do in teaching that make it work better. And so the basic principle is that the student needs to be learning, practicing making decisions that, like, and problems and solving that an expert would, and making those decisions while getting good feedback on them. And that means as they make a decision, they get timely, specific, actionable feedback on how they can improve. But so that's what has to be happening. But we know a lot about what has to go into this process of designing the practice exercises that they need to be doing, and then the implementation of those things in the class. And so I'll say a little about some of these. I don't have time to go into detail on all of them, but I'll say a few things we know about them, starting with the disciplinary expertise. They need to have them, you want them to be practicing making decisions like an expert would in that subject. But before I go into that, I'll just say that this slide sort of defines teaching expertise, in that it is a set of practices that research show consistently produce more learning. So what are some of these practices? Well, first, the disciplinary expertise is one that my own group has been studying. We've looked at how experts in science and engineering solve authentic problems in their subject. And we found that their process is really defined by making a specific set of decisions. And what was surprising was that these were the same 29 decisions across all the different fields of science and engineering, which we looked at many different ones. And so that may sound strange and surprising to you, but it's not when you actually look at what these decisions are. They're things like, first, once faced with a problem, deciding what concepts and models actually are relevant to solving that, deciding what information is relevant, what's irrelevant, and what's needed, deciding what approximations or simplifications are appropriate for solving, deciding potential solution methods to pursue, and that usually involves also deciding what similar problems as one seen before that are related. And then this continues on down through a whole different set of planning and execution, and then deciding when you get to a possible solution or conclusion, deciding does it make sense and deciding how to test it. And so it turns out across all these different fields that experts make these same sets, this consistent set of decisions, but it's important to realize that although the decisions are the same across different fields of science, how to make those decisions, that always requires specialized knowledge about the field. And that knowledge is organized as a way to optimize actually making the decisions in it. And so in the practice problems, you want to have the students have the opportunity to make these decisions in a problem that calls upon the disciplinary knowledge that you want them to solve. And so that goes in, that's really how you design the problem solving exercises that students will have. You have to have an authentic problem context, and then using the subject knowledge that you want them to master. And this is the requirements for the kind of exercise for the brain to learn to be an expert or more expert in this subject matter. Now, if you actually look at all these decisions, though, you realize that in most typical courses, they remove the decisions from what the students actually practice doing. For example, all the information and only the information need to solve it is given, and what approximations and simplifications they're supposed to make are actually specified. And so those are all removed from what the student's practicing, and it's actually also why they're not learning very well. And if you actually go back to the original question I started with about why these students were coming into my research lab able to do well in all these courses but not able to do physics, this is the reason. In these courses they were learning information, they were learning memorized procedures, but they weren't learning to use this information to make decisions like you had to do to actually do real physics. Okay, let me now jump over these other things that are sort of fairly obvious. You need to have the right difficulty of problems to match up the students' prior knowledge and experience to make them challenging but not impossible. You need to have them designed to have students really strongly motivated to learn, because they have to be working hard to exercise their brain properly. So that goes into motivation and choosing problems that are more motivating for students to be relevant. But then I'm going to say something about basic brain constraints, because these are some things that cognitive psychologists have established really well, but university teachers don't know and don't realize how important they are. So the first of these has to do with memory and how the memory works. And it turns out that your brain there's two types. There's a long-term memory. That's what most of us think of when we think about memory, and it has a very large capacity and a very long duration. But then there's something called a short-term working memory. And this is really a buffer that information has to go through before it can go into the long-term memory. And this buffer, in contrast to long-term memory, has a tiny capacity. It's around, for a typical human brain, it's about 5 to 7 new items. It works on time scales of minutes. This is how long it kind of lasts for. And this is really what the brain can pay attention to. And so because it has such a limited capacity, whenever there's some new item comes in, new piece of information, it pushes something out of the working memory. And so that doesn't get processed and into long-term memory. And so this constraint on working memory turns out to be really important in that every additional item reduces the processing and learning that the brain has. And so if you look at things that happen in class, you have many different things that can overload the working memory and therefore interfere with learning. And first is just split attention. If the students are checking their cell phones or on their computers, looking at email or something else, splitting their attention, it's just a disaster with learning because it overloads their working memory and blocks out all the important things you want them to be thinking about and learning. And this is even worse when you're teaching online because there's so many other distractions on the computer screen for the students. Now, of course, just the amount of coverage in a regular course and typical lecture is also just way too much for the working memory to absorb. And so that's one of the big reasons that when we measure the amount of learning from a typical lecture, it's so small because it's just overwhelmed the capacity of the working memory. But there's also lots of things you can do to reduce the demands on working memory by, for example, reducing jargon, or when you have a picture, making sure that it's just very simple, basic things you want to convey. That's really good for reducing demands on working memory to have a good picture as opposed to just a verbal description. But you want to make sure it doesn't have any extra nice little features they'll often put in just to be more attractive. Because those, if they get attention, that attention is actually using up working memory. And even funny little jokes or stories actually hurt learning because they take away attention from the key material you want students to be paying attention to. Now, another aspect of how the brain works has to do with long-term memory. And it turns out the biggest problem, well, we clearly want students to remember things and be able to recall them for a long time. But it turns out that the biggest problem with long-term memory is not getting it into the memory, although that's not trivial, but it's the correctly recalling it. And particularly after learning additional information, because if you learn additional stuff, it interferes with the things that you already know and try and recall. But it turns out that there's an easy way to suppress this interference with new learning. So what it means is that it's important not to teach like we usually do, of covering chapter 1 and problems and exams on chapter 1, and then chapter 1's done, and then one just goes on to chapter 2 and chapter 3 and so on. But in fact, you need to periodically revisit, as you're covering chapter 2 and 3, revisit what was in chapter 1, and so that your brain basically in that process sorts out how to go to chapter 1 and doesn't have these interference in recall that are so that make it so much harder to recall things if you haven't dealt with them. So that's sort of the things that are important in the design of the practice activities. Now, there's some things that are important also in the implementing of these in classes that we've seen are important to make them effective. The first one is you have to design good tasks, and that's what I described, but also it's important to have clear deliverables. And these are things that every student has to actually complete to do as part of the learning process. And so this would be, for example, some worksheets or questions they have to be answering and that explain their reasoning and defending how they're thinking. Now, in addition, there's the idea of working in groups that is found overwhelmingly that people are developing these new active learning methods. They find they work best if the students are working in small groups where a number of 3 to 4 students is an optimum in a group. And there's a question of sort of why this works. And a lot of times instructors will think of, well, how can talking to a fellow student be better than actually just hearing the explanation from the instructor? And the answer is it's really true that talking with a fellow student is better. And there's a couple of reasons. One is you can get more immediate feedback on an aspect you may be confused about or something that having another student right away that can help you with that's beneficial. But there's also a more fundamental process, which is a sort of how the brain is wired for social learning. And it turns out, and this has been rather extensively studied, that the process of explaining something to somebody else or thinking about teaching somebody else, it actually triggers a unique, different cognitive processing in the brain, and that actually produces more learning. And so doing lots of studies where comparing students are studying something to learn it versus having to think about that they're going to teach somebody else that material, they actually think about it differently, that actually produces greater learning through that social interaction. And finally, it's also very useful to a teacher to listen in on these student conversations to give you so much more information about how the students are thinking, and so you can provide more useful feedback to them. So with that, I guess I'm just about finished here. Just conclude that the research is now showing us what good teaching design and implementation is, and how this is, we can both see how this is better learning than the traditional lecture and exam process we have. And we can understand why it's working better, understanding in terms of how the brain is actually developing better capabilities through this practicing the thinking that you need. Now, just since this comes up these days in lots of times when talking about this is does this kind of teaching work better online? And I would say, yes, it in many respects, it's the differences are greater, more effective teaching this way online, but it does require somewhat more structure and attention to details to get to have students work in the right way because of things that it's just harder to correct in real time and online than it is in a class in an in-person setting. So with this, I'll stop and I'll just say here's some references if you want to learn more about this, some books, some of my favorite books here on teaching and learning, and this website here, the CWSAI website. This has a bunch of short 2-page references on implementing particular teaching methods and approaches. And finally, this just our reference on expert problem solving and how it can be thought of as a guide for better teaching and assessment of learning. So with that, I'll stop and answer questions.
Yeah, thank you very much, Carl. For this very interesting in clear lecture. And let me first ask the audience whether anyone have questions. They could either write something or raise your hands. And there's one thing from Yifan Jane. And she said that I have two questions. Can you see? Can you read the from the chat box, Carl?
Yes. Okay. Yeah. So the question is, yeah, since new teaching method was shown more effective, do faculty who once used the new teaching method continue this way in their teaching? And we found that in the programs I've run, we've supported. So first, I'll say that there are cases where people have introduced faculty to teaching these ways, and they try them a little bit, and then they stop. In the programs I've run, we really work with not just kind of telling faculty a little bit how to do them, but we give them support and understanding the details about why they work and how they work and what you need to do to make them effective. And in our programs, both at Colorado and British Columbia and now at Stanford, we see that once people have switched, they completely continue teaching this way. And we find that most of them, or basically all of them, sort of say, well, they never consider switching back because they find this such a much more rewarding way of teaching. They feel that they're much better contact with the students. The students are much more engaged in the material, asking many more interesting questions. And so it's as much, the faculty seem to stay with teaching this way as much because they enjoy it more as that it's useful for or better for the students. Now, okay, then the second question is, the new method needs the instructor to circle around and give instructions during the discussion. Does this mean we need more TAs to help with the course? With only one instructor, it seems to be hard to take care of all the student groups. So this is a good question. And it depends on how many students you have. What I would say is we see that one instructor can usually handle around 40, roughly 40 students. And once you start to having more than that in a class, so you have 200 or so, it's really then helpful to have one TA for every 40 or 50 students, just to cover the range of student questions and be able to respond in a reasonable fashion. But I'd say, that's a number that most instructors who are teaching this way find they can handle. I mean, it's always helpful to have more people to help, but 40 or 50 is a pretty reasonable number for someone to handle.
So yeah, you can read it. Yeah, this is from Professor Minko.
Yeah, so there's about traditional tests and exams. Do we need a new type of testing? Yeah, this is a great question. And the answer is very definitely yes. We need that. If you look at the traditional test where students are sort of locked up and they have no resources to look at and they have to kind of just try and remember everything, the thinking that's involved in doing well on a test like that is so fundamentally different from what's used in solving any real problem in the real world, where you have access to other resources, you can talk with other people, you have to go figure out where to get information. So I would argue that our traditional tests are and we have fair amount of data on this. Traditional tests are really not measuring anything that's very useful, and that you really need better tests that from just a learning standpoint, it turns out if you have lower stakes tests where you give the student more immediate feedback is always better for learning, but also just I would argue that tests which have things like open book tests where students have access to other information, but just have to still be doing things, making decisions, justifying decisions, much more than just kind of being able to do a simple memorized procedure. The decision-based testing is much more meaningful. Okay, now I have another question here. Before group problem-solving activities, do you give time to answer questions students have from their reading assignments? Typically, yes. I would stress, though, that one mistake that's sometimes made is that instructors expect students to do too much learning from the reading in advance. And, in some ways, I'd say it's not fair to make the students have to learn a lot from just reading something, because that's just too hard. And the reading assignments are really kind of more basic information that you want the students to have as preparation, so that they're doing more of the learning in class when they have more support from the instructor and other students to help. So the reading shouldn't be too demanding of the students, but in any case, yeah, typically you would give students, they would have some time to ask questions about the pre-class reading at the beginning of class.
So Professor Lin, Lin has another question. Can you read it?
Yes. So yeah, they're worrying about the jokes and interesting stories or pictures that they want the students to this is for keeping students motivated. And I do get a complaint a lot when I bring this up, because the instructors will say, oh, but when I'm telling jokes or funny stories, that's the only time students are paying attention to me. And the students will say that's the only time they pay attention in class. And that's exactly the problem, because they're paying attention to the joke. That means they're not paying attention to the material in class. And so I think that, the idea is it's not a joke or some nice picture isn't fundamentally a problem. It's just that it has to be directly connected with the learning that you want them to be having, because otherwise it's just they're thinking about something different from what you want them to be learning, and that interferes with it. So, I'd say the challenge in motivation is important, is to have the students motivated and interested, but interested in the material itself. And so one just has to think very hard about, how do you make this subject meaningful and interesting and worthwhile to the students in the way you present it by itself. And it's not easy necessarily, but still, I think that's the real requirement. Okay.
There's another one. Yes.
I have to,
It's about the peer feedback.
Yes. So yeah, this is an important question about how to have students practice providing feedback or being involved in a discussion. And this is an important element so I'm glad you brought this up, is that, it's important, especially if students aren't familiar with being, teaching this way. It really is important to introduce them to the idea of of this working in groups and how the importance of everybody contributing and how they behave, the norms of behavior, how you respond and interact in the group, and the value of what people have to do to make this experience valuable. And so having a brief session that's quite explicitly devoted to that is a valuable thing to do. And then one also, as you're an instructor sort of monitoring the class, you also want to monitor how the groups are interacting, and if no people aren't saying anything, calling on all the more students to be involved in the discussion. And sometimes you'll have people who are dominating the discussion and interrupting other people, and you need to gently intervene with that behavior as well, to control the make sure the discussion's valuable and effective. I will say it's surprisingly easy to get groups to adopt better interaction methods once they are given some guidance about how to do it. But they need help, but they can learn pretty quickly because it's pretty natural to people. Okay, next is, how about required load to implement it in mass scale to students, the amount of new knowledge that can be covered. I guess I'm not really sure I know about that as to what is kind of the reasonable load and how to decide that. So I think I'll just pass on that question. In terms of the amount of new knowledge students can learn, I look at that as something that is really an empirical question, that it's impossible for anyone to just decide what students are or are not capable of learning in a given amount of time with a given exercise. One just has to do the experiment and have the students go through the activity and see what they're capable of, and adjust what you're doing accordingly. Okay, so here's what we just suggest all the faculty here. We want to try the new teaching method. I mean, well, you just have to do it, I'd say. I mean, you can read, in my work, some of my, in the book, and some of my papers about other people and have written about this, and the references I show on the screen here about, particularly I would say about the book on how learning works, and then the ABCs of how we learn, and particularly discusses the details of some of these teaching methods, and importantly the underlying principles behind them, so that you understand not just what you want to do, but why to do it, so you can adjust to the circumstances. And then you just have to start trying it.
Carl, may I ask how widespread is such a new teaching method? I mean, is everybody in Stanford using this the new method, or some other universities are doing that also?
No, I'd say we don't really know how widely adopted this is. I think it's pretty clear that it's becoming, at least in North America, it's becoming fairly widespread with the teaching of introductory physics in particular. But it's growing in use in biology certainly too, and then slower, but some in chemistry and mathematics. But it's, so there's a substantial amount, but it's certainly still the minority of classes taught this way. It's not, at Stanford, in the physics department, we have sort of, as I say now, a substantial fraction of the physics majors courses are being taught this way, but it's still it's maybe 25% of the faculty are doing this teaching, but it's more every year. So it's particularly the younger faculty are adopting it pretty readily.
Well, some times ago, I mentioned your method to the high command of our Ministry of Education, and they're intrigued and interested, and they said that, well, maybe you could invite Professor Wieman to come to Taiwan, and then we could talk and see. And if that occasion arises again, we would like to really to invite you to come and then to have a brainwashing our Ministry of Education. Would you like to do that?
Yeah, but my travel is very limited right now, so.
Okay, then we bring our Ministry of Education to you.
Yeah.
Yeah, but then there are many things we could do by communication, and then you have also a team of very, very talented people, right, helping you. So yeah, and because we are working with them on a science education project, as you know, and we are very, very interested, in this very stimulating, inspirational.
Yeah, because I think it does have the potential to make a big impact. I mean, when we see it's put in place, students are just learning more and they're enjoying it more. And so
now, Dr. Sun Liu asked an important question. Can you read it?
Yeah, is it applicable to student groups much younger? And so that's a good question. I would say that we can be pretty confident that everything I've talked about here is applicable to secondary school. Once you get younger than secondary, then the trouble in general with just the lower grade levels are there's more variables involved, and so it's just how to get things right and what you need to do to make things work gets more challenging just because there's so many additional variables you have to take into account. But then in addition, I'd say the things you want students to be learning and the thinking once you're at the primary and middle school level there's certainly some overlap, but there's also some significant differences. And so I am hesitant to be too confident about how it would, how it would apply. There's certainly some things and some aspects of the research that have been done at that level, but it's limited, and I don't have nearly the confidence that I would. But I think secondary, where you can be pretty confident and the things will work, and they are being done there. In some places they're being used and with success.
One dilemma our university faculty in science and education facing in Taiwan is that whatever you do, in the class, at the end, the student will always go to, they were aiming for working in the semiconductor industry. As you know, that our semiconductor industry is very short of people, And so in a way, our faculty are in a way rather discouraged. So I mean, this the social environment which affect the kind of dictating the how we teach too. and in America, of course, it's a bit different.
Yeah, no, I mean, there are, right, there's a whole variety of different cultural and environmental factors that affect this, I recognize, but I think that still the general features about how having the students being the practicing thinking, the thinking that you want them to learn, and doing more practice of that and getting feedback on how to improve that thinking, that's going to be applied quite generally.
Right, true. Yeah, very true. So anyone has a question still, because it's reaching an hour, and then we take up a lot of class time too already. If not, we will end our session now, and we want to thank Carl for this very nice lecture, and I have been reading in his papers and book for a while, and I'm so happy to see him, in real person, and I look forward to meeting you, in person again, talk about your great ideas. Yeah, thank you so much.
Well, thank you. It's been a pleasure.